Well, welcome to the City Bible Forum, and I'd like to introduce our guests. On the far side of the panel, Dr. Ron Weiser. He's a prominent member of Sydney's Jewish community, and I think the honorary life president of the Zionist Council of Australia. And closer to me, Dr. Jake Lynch. He's a professor of peace studies at the University of Sydney Centre for Peace Studies. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Our question today, can there be peace in the Middle East? And I want to start by asking each of you first, what would peace in the Middle East look like? What would peace in the Middle East look like? Let's start with you, Ron.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having us. Look, peace to me would look like people being able to go about their own business, their daily needs, their communal needs, and the needs of their national needs without violence, and an ability to, with respect for everyone else around them, have the ability to conduct all of their lives on those different levels.
Jake.
I think I find nothing to disagree with. It may disappoint some of you to hear in what Ron has said. Of course, the devil is in the detail, and it's what people want to do and where, which is the problem here. But one, I suppose, insight which I would enter here is that the normative stance of our centre and what we apply in our research and teaching and everything else is not merely peace, but peace with justice. And peace with justice means that people can have their needs and aspirations met, and in particular that injustice be effectively opposed and transformed so that the underlying issues in the conflict are not a source of division but a source of unity for the future.
So that poses a very interesting question. Is conflict justified, or in fact are violent means justified when the end is to bring about justice?
Well, I think there we come to what, if you'll bear with me, is one of the chief kind of theoretical insights of peace research, which is my business these days, which is the distinction between conflict and violence. Conflict we define as a relationship between two or more parties who have or think they have incompatible goals, whereas violence is only one of a whole range of different possible responses to conflict. In a sense, on that definition, if you think about it, we are all immersed in conflicts all the time. You could even say that our survival to this point in life testifies to our success in handling the implicit conflict between human life and a return to a state of nature. So conflict is fine. Conflict can be a source of creativity. What we're trying to do is to bear down on and minimise violence of all kinds.
And so you could work for a just outcome without resorting to violent means. That would be a positive conflict in your terms, the terms of your centre?
That would be a creative conflict.
Ron, do you see a similar view towards the achievement of justice? Because the question of justice is at the very heart of the creation of the State of Israel and remains at the very heart of efforts to contain peace or to provide peace in the Middle East today.
So on the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations made what, in my view, is a very wise decision in order to resolve the conflict and to try and do so without violent means, without leading to war and so forth, by partitioning this area. And they were very specific. It wasn't into a state called Israel and a state called Palestine. It was into a Jewish state and an Arab state, so that the national aspirations of both groups of people could be resolved and they could live side by side in mutual recognition. Of course, the Jewish people in the State of Israel accepted this decision, and until today, this hasn't been accepted by the other side, and that's what I see as the source of the conflict. This is the oddest conflict in the world because it's not about borders, it's not about Jerusalem, it's not about settlements. It's simply about each side recognising the other's right to exist as a sovereign state.
But let's return to this justice theme, because in the name of justice and achieving a more secure peace, there has been a dreadful lot of violence and indeed violent conflict leading up to the worst kinds of conflict. It persists to this day, undertaken not only by nations but also by individuals.
So I don't think either of us will condone resolving the conflict by violent means. It can only be resolved by bilateral negotiations, not by a unilateral declaration, either by Israel or by the Palestinians. And the current move at the United Nations is exactly that. It's a unilateral declaration of a Palestinian state without recognition of the Jewish state alongside of it, which is the reason why it's not getting through the Security Council, and it's not just having to face the American veto, but other Western democratic nations have decided not to support that move, at least until now, until there's a bilateral deal. The State of Israel has always, from day one, accepted that there should be a State of Palestine alongside of it. When the State of Palestine will accept, or the Palestinian leadership will accept, that a Jewish state can live alongside of it, I think then we can have a basis for going forward and resolving the other issues in this conflict.
Well, we'll come to our SMS questions in a moment. Just a reminder that you can SMS your questions. Just want to explore this very briefly. So, Ron, your suggestion is that peace could happen today if there was a two-state, two-people solution, Israel and Palestine, each having state recognition, and that means recognising the other? That's your contention?
Absolutely.
And Jake, is that would that be an acceptable solution from your point of view?
Well, I mean, there is no way to peace. Peace is the way. And what has to be acknowledged, I think, is that there is a kind of transmitted collective... There are transmitted collective experiences of injustice on all sides of this conflict. Now, for the Palestinians to have their own state is something which opinion polls have suggested consistently over the years. It is something which Palestinian people would regard as delivering justice in respect of the transmitted collective injustice that they have experienced. So that would wrap up that particular issue. And it might leave other issues.
Yeah, what are the experience of the Jewish people who have always, since 1947, faced the reality of the Arab states saying that they literally wanted to push them into the sea? So recognition for Israel, in your terms, would also be a just solution?
Well, I mean, Israel has its recognition. Israel is a state, and the borders of what is recognised as the State of Israel by the world community are the green line which existed prior to 1967.
And what about the community around Israel?
What, the rest of the Arab world, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Israel formed a peace agreement with Egypt under President Sadat, under the auspices of the Carter administration in 1979. Israelis sometimes refer to that, in my experience, as a cold peace. That was a cold peace. It did not necessarily lead to a warming of relations between people on either side of that border. There are many riddles contained within this question. One of them, I suppose, a kind of counterpart to that one, is the extraordinary stories of individual reconciliation and joint working by groups of Israelis and Palestinians at the grassroots. And one of the riddles is why that doesn't translate, why that can't be projected onto a political agreement which would satisfy all sides.
Isn't this a riddle? Israel has recognition of the international community through the United Nations, and it's recognised by other sovereign states around the world.
By other states.
But not by its neighbours.
Well, I mean, recognition of a state is in the gift of other states. No
so
one
is there
state,
any peace or justice?
No one state can force another state to recognise a third state.
So is there any peace or justice unless the neighbours themselves recognise Israel's right to exist?
Recognition of Israel as a state by its neighbours would be evidence, to my mind, that the underlying justice issues were being transformed from sources of division into sources of unity and friendship.
Look, Israel is the strangest country on the globe. I mean, Australia you can define on a map. France you can define on a map. Nobody in this room can draw me a map of the State of Israel. There's no such map because her borders haven't actually been defined. You have certain borders, the Mediterranean. In 2000, the United Nations determined a border with Lebanon. The peace treaty with Egypt didn't determine the borders of Israel, it determined the borders of Egypt. The peace treaty with Jordan determined the borders of Jordan, not the borders of Israel, not all of the borders. The thing about it is that when any country has come forward to recognise Israel, Egypt and Jordan, Israel has removed the people who were living in contested areas, and Israel has done many steps to ensure that there can be some mutual recognition. The definition of peace with the neighbours will be when there's a Saudi embassy inside the State of Israel, which there isn't. And we have to also face the question that the leadership of the Palestinians today, Mahmoud Abbas is the president of the Palestinian people, but part of his coalition is Hamas, who openly declared that they will not accept a State of Israel of any size. And part of his coalition, even of the PLC, of his own Fatah faction, openly declare, particularly in Arabic when they speak to their Arabic audiences, that establishing a state of Palestine is only the first step. Mahmoud Abbas himself wrote on the 5th of September in the New York Times that his strategy in going to the United Nations was to end 63 years of occupation. Not occupation since 1967, but since actually the establishment of the State of Israel. So that's something that needs to be overcome.
We'll come back to the question of borders, I feel, before we close today. But a question from one of our SMSs. What would happen if, to the peace process if the United States was to withdraw its support to Israel? And of course the context of that is that whatever happens in the General Assembly of the United Nations, the United States has made its position with regards to the Security Council quite clear.
Well, I don't think it's the United States.
Let's go with you and then we'll go with you.
I don't think it's just the United States. I think that the Palestinians came to the United Nations expecting that the United States would have to exercise its veto and were surprised by what we call the moral minority of the United Nations, the Western world, the democratic governments of the world, actually saying to the Palestinians that a unilateral pathway isn't what's going to work. And we have just now the example of the Quartet coming forward with its own proposal. The Quartet is a fairly significant body. Prime Minister Netanyahu has accepted the invitation of the Quartet and the parameters set by the Quartet. And as I've said before, unless something's changed in the last half hour, the Palestinians have refused to accept coming to a negotiating table under the supervision or the auspices of the Quartet with no preconditions.
Dr. Jake Lynch, what would happen if the US withdrew its support?
Well, can I make a couple of points? I mean, first of all, on the question of the borders, Hamas spokespersons say many different contradictory things. And the Hamas charter is often contradicted by interviews given by various Hamas spokespersons. And one point, though, remains. If nobody knows what the borders of Israel actually are, how can Hamas be expected to recognise the State of Israel? How can it be expected to accept the State of Israel?
We're going to come back to the border question, but answer me the US question.
They interlock. These questions interlock, you see. I mean, first of all, on the US question, here's a curious episode. On the face of it, a curious episode. President Mahmoud Abbas and then Prime Minister Ehud Olmert were both negotiating under the auspices of Condoleezza Rice when she was Secretary of State in the Bush administration, in many ways the acceptable face of the Bush administration, in the Annapolis Accords. And they were committed to bringing into being a Palestinian state on an agreed border by the end of 2008. Now, in June 2008, Ehud Olmert was summoned for a meeting in Washington, didn't see Condoleezza Rice, curiously enough, you may think, but instead spent a few hours hunkered down with President Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney. To some of us, the unacceptable face of the Bush administration. And then when he returned to Israel, and I remember this as clear as if it were yesterday, the shot of him for his interview was on the tarmac of the airport with the steps of his plane still clearly visible in the background. It was then he started talking about the pendulum swinging towards an attack on Gaza. Now, at that stage, we had a ceasefire that had been brokered by the Egyptians, which held for several more months, and a suggestion emerges from that, which to my mind goes with a very great deal of other evidence, that in fact some elements in the United States do not want to see necessarily a satisfactory resolution to this question. What they want is to pursue the strategic aim of the United States, which is to remain indispensably involved in the Middle East region. And that is written in an abundance of documentation when the United States security establishment and the military-industrial complex has come to define what its strategic aims are.
Well, let's come to this question then. Why do we have such an intractable problem? We can describe the history. We can describe the treaties. We can describe the political manifestations of the problem over many, many years since 1947. But are we not actually talking about something that goes back centuries? The whole conflict over Israel, Jerusalem itself, lies probably at the heart of this question, where to this very day you've still got the extraordinary reality of major religions all having a spiritual connection with a single site, coexisting at that physical presence. How much of this goes beyond the ability of human beings to resolve? We'll start with you, Ron.
I think that's an easy way out, to just say human beings can't resolve it. I don't believe that it is a religious conflict. I believe it's a political conflict that's being painted as a religious conflict by those on whichever side who don't feel that they want a solution to be found. I remind everybody that when Israel accepted partition, it accepted a state without Jerusalem as part of its borders. And yet, nevertheless, the Jewish people still accepted that division, but with the guarantee that Jerusalem would be an international city, that we'd have access to the holy sites and so forth. We know what happened. The Arab side did not accept that deal. They expelled the Jews from the Old City. They destroyed many of the Jewish holy sites, and they denied Jews access to the western wall of the temple. And that is deeply ingrained, that experience, in the Israeli psyche, and it's why under any two-state solution, two-state for two-people solution, which every Israeli government has supported, notwithstanding, it's very interesting. I haven't heard before that usually it's people. I come to panels and people claim Israel's determining American policy, right. But this is the first time I've heard that it was America that pulled Israel back out of a peace process. I don't accept that for a second. Ehud Olmert and every other 6 prime ministers of Israel since 1993 have offered sincerely two-state for two-people solution. You're dealing with a democracy where it's easily 90% of the population is in favour of that solution. Jerusalem can be shared. There is a plan that exists for the sharing of Jerusalem. It's called the Yossi Beil and Abu Mazen plan. Abu Mazen is the other name for Mahmoud Abbas, the current head of the Palestinian Authority. Yossi Beil negotiated when he was deputy foreign minister. And both sides, the Jews and the Arabs, have held to this plan in terms of the development of Jewish suburbs and Arab suburbs and so forth. There's many plans exist many times. We've seen the same plan for the sharing of Jerusalem. I think it has to be shared. But what's undeniable is that at least since 1967, when it's been under Israeli custody, all 3 religions, monotheistic religions, have had unfettered access to the holy
Well, you actually
sites.
mentioned 1967. I want to come back to you, Jake, on this spiritual question in a moment. But before that, one of our SMS questioners has said, well, what about 1967? That this was a time when Israel effectively didn't recognise the borders and moved for what it saw as just reasons to take territory that was going to secure its borders.
On the contrary, Israel didn't start the 67 war. It was started by Egypt evicting the United Nations observers and then blockading the Straits of Tiran, Israel's southern port of Eilat. Immediately after the Six-Day War, in a government of national unity, which included the left and the right in Israel, they made the offers to the Arab world of the Golan Heights to Syria, the West Bank to Jordan, Gaza to Egypt, with the exception of Jerusalem because of the previous experience. And on the 29th of August at the Arab League Summit at Khartoum, they were rewarded with the 3 no's: no to negotiation, no to recognition, and no to peace. And after that, the government of national unity in Israel ended. The left-wing government, the Labour government, ruled for the next 10 years. And effectively, it's the left wing in Israel that's built the bulk of the so-called settlements that are just over the Green Line, primarily to the south of Jerusalem and to the east of Jerusalem, in order to, if you like, protect Jerusalem as a holy city for Jewish access. But recognising, and by the way, the Green Line was never a border that was accepted by anybody. It was just an armistice line where a war ended. Right. But Israelis, and even Prime Minister Netanyahu only last week repeated the fact that he's willing to start negotiations from the point of the Green Line with agreed land swaps.
And maybe that's a step forward. I want to come back to this question because here we are once again looking whether it's for the whether it's to protect the holy sites or whether it's to create a political fact. Nonetheless, the settlement program is described in both of those terms, in a sense. Jake, do you think that it's possible to find a peace in the Middle East without some kind of spiritual solution? Or is it, in other words, is it a spiritual conflict? How much are we incapable of solving that unless we deal with a reconciliation of the human heart?
I don't think it's essentially a spiritual conflict. I mean, I agree with Ron to that extent. I think it wears religious clothes, and some people put on religious clothes to discuss it for their own purposes sometimes. I do think that Jerusalem in particular is a city to which people feel allegiance and emotional attachment, which long predates the modern system of nation states. You know, I was at an iftar dinner organised by the Australian Federal Police a couple of weeks ago, and one of the speakers told the story of a prominent follower of the Prophet Muhammad. I'm afraid I can't remember the name of the follower, but anyway, he went to Jerusalem and he went to a Christian church and was invited in to pray in the Christian church and declined because he says, if I do that, then successive generations of Muslims will want to take over this site, and I don't want to do that for the sake of peace. My point would be, today he probably couldn't get in. Because if he came from outside the territories concerned, he would run into what is the kind of appurtenances of the modern national state, which is that it exerts control over its own borders. He would have to have a passport. He would have to satisfy all sorts of conditions. And that's a menace to Jerusalem, to be inserted into that system. And that's one of the riddles here. And, we could, we talk about a two-state solution, a one-state solution. in my opinion, it would do some good, in a kind of indirect general sense, to start conceiving of a many-state solution and look to parts of the world where human beings have proved capable of transcending this situation, like, for example, the Schengen countries at the heart of the European Union, where borders of national states have come to matter a bit less in people's ability to conduct their business than they did before. That would be altogether healthy for this situation.
Well, certainly in our time, close by, the reconciliation process in South Africa has been an extraordinary example of what can take place when a nation looks to the whole issue of peace and justice in a way that goes beyond just borders or lines on a map. Is that something that you could ever imagine happening in Israel and with its borders, with its neighbours in Palestine and Egypt and so on?
I mean, one of the central portions of the successful transformation of conflict in South Africa was the bargain encapsulated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. That is to say that if I was a black South African, for example, maybe I was the son of a trade union activist, my father might have disappeared one night some years ago and I might never have seen him again. And I would have been left firstly with the loss of my father and secondly with not knowing what happened to him. Now, I had the right to get the people who took him away and probably killed him to be had up in court, sentenced and jailed. But I decided to trade that right for appearing in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and having these people actually come clean about what happened to him and their part in it. And I accepted that in the context of a political transformation. That is to say, an access of justice and a remedy to an historic injustice. Now, if the occupation of 1967 were to be ended tomorrow, if the whole panoply of settlements, settler-only roads, separation fences which have divided and reticulated Palestinian land were to be removed tomorrow, were to be abandoned tomorrow, that might represent one portion, at least, of a sense of justice being delivered in respect of a transmitted historic injustice, which could enable people to make that kind of trade on an individual level.
Well, let's see if Ron thinks that sort of trade might be possible.
The difference there is in the South African experience is you have one state replacing another state. Effectively, that's what you had. You had a white administration, apartheid state, being replaced by a democratic state where every citizen had its full rights.
Didn't you have an undemocracy, whatever the word is, being replaced by a democracy?
Democracy, that's right. But the conflict in the Middle East isn't going to be resolved by a one-state solution. And, you know,
but let me bring you back to the reconciliation idea, Ron, because what happened after that, the question is a reconciliation necessary in order to find the peace?
So I think that in this conflict, I think for true peace to be found, reconciliation is absolutely vital. But the problem is, how do you get to that reconciliation? Yes. And I think that in this case, it's quite different from the South African case. By the way, also, you know, you haven't yet seen a leader amongst the Palestinians of the stature of Nelson Mandela. But, you know, you have I think in the first instance, you have to resolve the political dispute with the two-state for two-people solution. And I think in this case, the reconciliation needs to be first at the state level, then trickling down, because Israel faces the problem of it being a democracy facing non-democracies. And, you know, it's fine to say that Hamas, had a ceasefire. It's just not true, though. I mean, for 8 years prior to Israel's operation in Gaza, over 10,000 rockets came down. Tell the people in Sderot that there was a ceasefire. Tell the people in Sderot, who had 15 seconds of warning every time a missile came over, that was some sort of a ceasefire. Israel has proven time and time again, because the settlements and the settlers are just a diversion from the real core issue. When it made a peace deal or when it made a treaty, whenever, it's uprooted people, it's moved people, sometimes people that have been there for a generation or two. It took every Jew out of Gaza and pulled them inside a so-called recognised international boundary, which wasn't recognised by Hamas. It's not Hamas. The issue isn't Hamas that they can define where Israel is. They're not willing to define an Israel of any size. They're not willing to accept the concept of the Jewish state existing. Now, in that circumstance, it's not possible to have reconciliation. It's not possible when the Palestinian ambassador to Lebanon, Abdallah says, only the day before the vote at the United Nations, that even if there'll be a Palestinian state, they will not issue a single visa to a single Palestinian refugee, that no Palestinian refugees can come and live inside the state of Palestine, and moreover, that this is not the end of the conflict. He said it very clearly. It's not the end of the conflict, it's just another stage from which for the conflict to continue.
Well, let me
so
put this
that's
to
not
you.
a path to reconciliation.
Okay. So the path is described still very much in political terms and
I think so.
and with international oversight of a peace agreement. But let me put this to you. I met recently a South African guy, a black South African, and he said for him, peace could only come when he was able to forgive the person who had murdered his son. A white landowner had dragged his son off a tractor that he was working on and murdered him and had not been pursued for justice in the apartheid regime. He said for him personally, whatever was happening around him, peace could only be found when he forgave that person. I just wonder whether we've not demonstrated that today, in a sense. We've talked about borders, we've talked about petitions, UN resolutions. But is peace only something that we can actually achieve from a person-by-person point of view at some sort of spiritual level?
Well, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Golda Meir, in the 1970s, said very clearly that peace can only come when Palestinians worry more about their children living than about Israelis dying or than killing Israelis. And I think that's absolutely the solution. Both sides have to desist from violence, recognise each other's national aspirations, and go back to that wise resolution 181 at the United Nations, and at least until true reconciliation can be achieved, but at least in the initial two states for two peoples, a separation of mutual respectability and respect for each other and mutual acceptance of each other's existence.
So mutual acceptance is a start. Can you move to forgiveness after that?
Sure, I think that's got to be part of the healing process, but the start has to be somewhere. And I think that in this conflict, the start has to be with the political solution and the separation, if you like, of the two sides, but mutual recognition and the end of conflict, a statement by both sides that each side will accept the other's existence.
Jake?
I have met people, and I'm sure Ron has met people, dare say people in the audience have met people, both Israelis and Palestinians, who are carrying out extraordinary acts of reconciliation and forgiveness. People in the parent circle, for example, who come together on the basis of having been bereaved in the conflict, usually having lost a child, which as a parent myself, I can't imagine how appalling that must be, and are well. I mean, there's nothing, exceptional about Israelis and Palestinians, which means they are incapable of reconciling and forgiving each other. Where it goes wrong is the failures of transmission of that, you might call it a spiritual process, to a political process. Yeah. And, there are abundant examples, not just in Israel and Palestine, of where popular will and the capacity of people at the grassroots level to imagine, work on, and between themselves bring about transformations of conflict fail to be transmitted to a political level. Well, there are examples here in Australia. I mean, if I can just continue for a moment, and this may not be unrelated to the problem, that it's some years now since clear majorities of Australian public opinion have favoured the withdrawal of Australian troops from what I regard as the catastrophic war in Afghanistan. And yet it still doesn't happen. And it's because these political initiatives are things which take shape around and between people. They are structural. And we are structured in to an American-led military alliance, which I think is a menace both in our part of the world and in the Middle East, let me add.
Well, we'll probably have to solve Afghanistan next week. But this week it's the Arab-Israeli conflict in the Middle East insofar as Israel is concerned. I'm just interested in your responses, though, to the Arab Spring movement. So here is the idea of peace and democracy, and certainly of revolutionary change, welling up from the tweeters and the marchers in the streets of Arab countries. Is that starting to make our efforts to solve these issues through nation-state negotiations look a little foolish? What do you think, Ron?
No, I think that the situation is so fluid around Israel, and the actually interesting thing is Israel being the only real democracy in the region, surrounded by what was previously countries that were stable but led by despotic dictators, with this process of the Arab Spring that's going on, and we see what's happening in Egypt. Certainly I don't have any expertise in this area, but I think that it's leading to a more chaotic situation within those countries, and we don't actually know who will turn out to lead these countries, and indeed whether they will be democracies or what will happen there.
But do you not take some comfort from what's been happening in some of the states around?
So I think that if we get through this period of chaos, which I think is extremely dangerous, and we've seen what's happened in Egypt with the chaos that's going on there and Egypt's inability to control its own border and the terrorist attack that occurred a few weeks ago over Eilat and the whole anarchy that's taking place at the moment in Sinai, that's the chaotic period. But if we get a democratic government in Egypt and hopefully a democratic government in Syria, I think that at least democracies attempt to resolve conflict by less violent means. And so I think that's a beacon of hope for Israel. But it's the period of chaos leading up to that, and I don't know if that's months, years or whatever, that poses us with a danger, in fact, for the area to go backwards into more violence.
Sure. Jake, what's your view of the Arab Spring?
Spring is a meme, is a contagious idea. We had the Prague Spring, now we have the Arab Spring. One interesting, if you like, Palestinian Arab Spring moment, Palestinians haven't had a whole season of the Arab Spring, probably only a few moments of the Arab Spring, came with the release of the Palestinian papers to Al Jazeera and the London Guardian in the early weeks of this year. And they detailed apparent concessions that the Palestinian leadership around Mahmoud Abbas were in the course of making in negotiations with Israel on the border between a future two states, and prompted angry demonstrations among Palestinians. Because the two states is really, in a sense, a signifier, as much as a signified, in the sense that the Palestinians growing up now since 1967 under an illegal occupation have had an experience of injustice which is both a direct one and an historically transmitted one. And, opinion pollsters consistently show that a majority of Palestinians would regard having their own state as an adequate form of justice to be delivered in respect of that injustice.
Would they be prepared to recognise the Israeli state?
But not if it's not on the Green Line. Not if it's going to involve having to live with the kind of appurtenances of occupation which Israel has set up in the last 45 years.
I don't think that's correct. I think that's highlighted, though, the problem that Mahmoud Abbas has made for himself. And that is that to the Israelis and to the Western world, he says one thing, but to his own people, he says something entirely different. And that's why, when he was about to potentially agree to what he'd been saying to what he'd been telling Israel and the Western world for all these years, a two-state for two-people solution, and his people found out about it, they objected to it because they couldn't understand how that meshed with what he'd been saying, to them for all of this time.
And they would never accept it because it would be unjust.
The map that everybody holds to is the map done by President Clinton, in fact, in December of 2000, which is at the time was agreed to by Ehud Barak as Prime Minister of Israel, and it's been agreed to by every other Israeli Prime Minister since. And that, effectively, people should look at that map. It entails Israel holding approximately 3% of the West Bank. It does not in any way interrupt any territorial contiguity, and it entails giving a land swap of that equivalent amount of area from, if you like, inside Green Line Israel. So that is the map that everybody, even Palestinian negotiators, had agreed to until President Obama came along and actually, I think, took the process backwards for 2 years when he had ignored all that had taken place beforehand.
Well, we're moving towards the end, but one of our questioners, perhaps, I don't know, in despondency or out of cynicism, I'm not sure, asks this. If peace occurred tomorrow, what would be the consequences for the current states and religions who have so much vested in the interests there? I guess in one sense it's begging, do we see the demonstration of people who don't have a lot invested in peace? Do they have more invested in continuing the conflict?
I think the Israelis believe, believe, and are desperate for peace. I don't think that there's any question that the vast, vast majority of Israelis want peace. They see peace as a two-state for two-people solution. They see it largely along the Green Line with adjustments, with the shared vision in Jerusalem. That's what's acceptable to the Israeli electorate. That's what's been proposed to the Israeli electorate on a number of occasions. What they haven't seen, at least from the Israeli perspective, is an agreement by the Palestinians to accept that as an end of conflict and as end of all claims. And by the way, also as a resolution of both sides' own refugee problems, meaning that the Jewish refugees were settled in Israel and the Palestinian refugees need to be settled in the future Palestinian state.
So, Jake, is there too much invested in the conflict to actually find peace?
Well, in 1992, if you'll forgive a professorial digression for a moment, the United States Defense Department published a note called Defense Planning Guidance. And in brief, it said that the United States has enjoyed two strategic victories, one in the Cold War and the other in the successful campaign to eject the forces of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And it said that in the future, another idea would be needed to bind countries in three key regions into an American-led security system. And the three key regions are the Far East, Europe, and the Middle East. And America positions itself as the nation which is indispensable to peace in the Middle East, and that suits its strategic interests. But if there was peace in the Middle East, it might not be needed anymore.
Well, we have time for the final question, and you know this is the most difficult of all, and you can only answer in one word. And that is, will we be back here, what are we now, 2011, October? Will we be back here in 10 years still debating the same issue? Jake?
Yes, but hopefully in a different way.
And Ron? That was more than one word.
I hope not.
Cheating.
That was also 3 words. Will you thank our panellists?
We both cheated, but me more than you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, fair enough. Will you please thank our panellists, Dr. Jake Lynch and Dr. Ron Weiser?